The year is 1849. Gold fever grips the nation, luring thousands westward with promises of instant riches. But for one young woman, the journey to California is not about gold. It's about a secret, a daring deception, and a desperate gamble for freedom. This is the untold story of Eliza Shirley, a woman who defied the conventions of her time, disguised herself as a man, and embarked on a perilous adventure across the American frontier. Her courage, resilience, and unwavering spirit would be tested by unforgiving landscapes, treacherous characters, and the constant threat of exposure. Yet, against all odds, she would forge a new identity, find unexpected allies, and ultimately carve out a place for herself in a world that sought to deny her very existence. Prepare to journey back in time to an era of unbridled ambition and raw survival, where one woman's audacious quest for liberty would become a legend whispered among the dusty trails and roaring rivers of the American West. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows across Eliza's face, illuminating the worry etched around her eyes. Outside, the gas lamps of Philadelphia glowed faintly, a testament to the burgeoning modernity that felt so far removed from her own suffocating reality. At 19, Eliza Shirley was expected to be a woman of grace, refinement, and suitable marital prospects. Her days were filled with needlework, piano lessons, and polite conversation, a gilded cage, as she often thought, designed to prepare her for a life of domesticity and quiet submission. But Eliza was not built for quiet submission. Her mind, sharp and inquisitive, chafed against the limitations placed upon her. She devoured books, not just the approved novels and poetry, but histories, scientific treatises, and travelogues that spoke of distant lands and daring adventures. Her dreams were not of a grand wedding or a comfortable parlor, but of wide-open spaces, of discovery, of a life lived on her own terms. Her father, a respected but rigid merchant, saw her independent spirit as a flaw to be corrected, a wild streak that needed taming. A woman's place, he would often intone, his voice firm, is in the home, tending to her family and upholding the family name. Her mother, a gentle soul worn down by years of societal expectation, offered only sympathetic glances and quiet sighs. The truth was, Eliza felt suffocated. The corsets that cinched her waist felt like iron bands around her spirit. The polite smiles and whispered gossip of society women felt like a constant performance. She yearned for authenticity, for a life where she could be herself, unburdened by the expectations of gender. The catalyst for her desperate plan arrived subtly, in the form of a newspaper article. It was late autumn of 1848, and the news from California was beginning to electrify the nation. Gold. Everywhere. Gold. The headline screamed of fortunes made overnight, of ordinary men striking rich in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The California Gold Rush was born, a siren song that drew men from every corner of the globe. Eliza read every word, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilarating possibility. While other women in her social circle discussed the suitable gowns for the upcoming season, Eliza was devouring maps, calculating distances, and imagining herself amidst the rugged wilderness. One evening, after the household had settled into its quiet rhythm, Eliza slipped into her father's study. The scent of aged paper and pipe tobacco hung in the air. Her father kept a collection of old clothes for rough work around the house. Discarded suits, sturdy trousers, and worn shirts. With trembling hands, Eliza began to try them on. The trousers felt alien, yet strangely liberating. They allowed her to move with an ease she had never experienced in her voluminous skirts. The loose-fitting shirts concealed her figure. She bound her chest tightly with strips of cloth, the inconvenience a small price to pay for the illusion she was creating. She experimented with her hair, tucking her long braids under a cap, then cutting a few unruly strands to make them appear shorter and more masculine. Staring at her reflection in the polished surface of her father's desk, a stranger looked back. A boy, perhaps 16 or 17, with wide, determined eyes. The transformation was crude, imperfect, but it was a start. A spark ignited within her, a fierce resolve that hardened her gaze. The next few months were a blur of meticulous planning. She saved every penny she could, pilfering small amounts from her allowance, selling a few pieces of forgotten jewelry to a sympathetic pawnbroker, always under the cloak of secrecy. She studied guidebooks to California, memorizing routes, learning about the dangers of the journey, and absorbing every detail about life in the goldfields. She practiced lowering her voice, adopting a more assertive posture, and walking with a confident stride. She even learned to spit discreetly, a habit she observed in the men who frequented her father's store. Her biggest challenge was convincing her family she was gone for good without revealing the truth. She fabricated a story, a desperate plea from a distant ailing aunt in Ohio who required immediate care. It was a flimsy excuse, but Eliza knew her father, ever concerned with appearances, would rather send her away than risk scandal or have her remain idle. The night before her departure, Eliza packed a small, sturdy valise. Inside, she placed a few essentials: a change of her newly acquired male clothing, a small amount of cash, a worn leather-bound journal, and a single, cherished photograph of her mother. She wrote a short, carefully worded letter to her parents, expressing her sorrow at leaving, but emphasizing the urgency of her aunt's condition. It knew it would not hold up to scrutiny for long, but it would buy her time. As dawn broke on that fateful morning in March 1849, Eliza Shirley stood at the precipice of a new life. She gazed at her reflection one last time, a young woman masquerading as a young man. Fear warred with exhilaration. What lay ahead was unknown, perilous, and utterly terrifying. But for the first time in her life, Eliza felt truly alive. She was no longer just Eliza Shirley, the dutiful daughter. She was, for all intents and purposes, a young man named Elias, and Elias was going to California. The journey to the bustling port of New York City was the first test of Eliza's disguise. She had purchased a ticket for the train, a marvel of modern engineering that thundered across the landscape, carrying her further and further from the familiar constraints of Philadelphia. Each clickety-clack of the wheels felt like a beat of a drum, propelling her towards an uncertain future. She sat hunched in her seat, cap pulled low, avoiding eye contact. Her heart hammered against her ribs every time a conductor or a fellow passenger glanced her way. She practiced her lower voice, answering in monosyllables, trying to blend into the sea of male travelers, many of whom were undoubtedly bound for the same golden dream. The city of New York, when she finally arrived, was a cacophony of sights, sounds, and smells. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, street vendors hawked their wares, and the air hummed with the energy of 1,000 lives intersecting. For a moment, Eliza felt utterly overwhelmed, a small, insignificant figure in a vast, indifferent world. Her immediate goal was to secure passage to California. The most common route was by sea, either around Cape Horn, a grueling, months-long voyage, or by crossing the Isthmus of Panama, a shorter but notoriously dangerous overland journey that connected two separate sea voyages. Eliza, ever practical, knew the Panama route, while risky, was her best option. It was faster, and, crucially, it would limit the amount of time she would have to maintain her disguise in the confined, close quarters of a ship. She found herself gravitating towards the bustling docks, where advertisements for various shipping companies plastered every available surface. Clippers, schooners, and steamships were all vying for the throngs of eager prospectors. Men with hopeful eyes and rough hands discussed routes, provisions, and the ever-present rumors of gold. Eliza, as Elias, adopted a cautious approach. She observed, she listened, and slowly she began to ask questions. She learned quickly that a lone young man, seemingly without a clear destination or connections, could easily become a target. She affected a quiet demeanor, listening more than speaking, and when she did speak, it was with a slight stammer, a calculated vulnerability that might disarm suspicion. She managed to secure passage on a steamer bound for Chagres, Panama for a surprisingly reasonable sum. The ship, the SS Falcon, was a grand paddle-wheel vessel, crammed with an assortment of humanity. Hardened miners, ambitious merchants, desperate dreamers, and a smattering of families making the arduous journey. On board, Eliza found herself sharing a cramped cabin with 3 other men. One was a burly, good-natured Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, whose boisterous laughter filled the small space. Another was a quiet, scholarly-looking gentleman named Mr. Davies, who always had his nose in a book. The third, a younger man named Thomas, was clearly nervous, his eyes wide with apprehension. Eliza maintained her distance, offering brief, polite acknowledgments. She feigned seasickness, spending much of her time on deck, ostensibly to get fresh air, but in truth to avoid extended conversations in the cabin. She wore her cap constantly, and in the dim light of the ship, her youthful features and slight build were less likely to draw undue attention. The journey south was largely uneventful, a monotonous rhythm of waves and engine hum. Eliza observed her fellow passengers, learning the subtle cues of male behavior. She noticed how they spoke, how they held themselves, how they interacted. She tried to mimic their casual swagger, their hearty handshakes, their tendency to spit tobacco juice over the ship's rail. Each small act was a layer added to her carefully constructed persona. One afternoon, a sudden squall lashed the ship. Waves crashed over the bow, sending spray high into the air. Many passengers retreated below deck, green-faced and terrified. Eliza, surprisingly, found a strange exhilaration in the chaos. She clung to a railing, feeling the raw power of the ocean, a stark contrast to the stifling drawing rooms of Philadelphia. In that moment, the fear of exposure seemed to recede, replaced by a sense of wild, untamed freedom. Patrick O'Malley, surprisingly steady on his feet, clapped her on the shoulder. "First time in a storm, lad?" he bellowed over the wind. Eliza, startled, managed a shaky nod. "Aye, it's a grand old beast, the sea," he chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "But she'll calm down directly. Just hold tight." His casual friendliness was disarming. Eliza found herself relaxing slightly in his presence. She realized that not every interaction had to be a high-stakes performance. Sometimes simply being present and reacting naturally was enough. As the SS Falcon approached the mosquito-infested shores of Chagres, a palpable buzz of excitement mixed with apprehension spread through the ship. This was where the real challenge began. The overland journey across the Isthmus of Panama was infamous for its dangers: disease, bandits, treacherous terrain, and scorching heat. Eliza watched as men made their final preparations, checking their weapons, securing their bags, and exchanging nervous jokes. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Up until now, her journey had been relatively contained, the disguise tested in limited, controlled environments. The jungles of Panama would be a different beast entirely. As the gangplank was lowered, and the first eager prospectors disembarked into the steamy, humid air of Chagres. Eliza took a deep breath. She had made it this far. There was no turning back now. Elias was ready for his next trial.
Chagres was a chaos of noise and humanity. The air hung thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth, tropical flowers, and human sweat. Native Panamanians, clad in loincloths and straw hats, mingled with eager American prospectors, shouting, bartering, and exchanging information in a dizzying array of languages. Canoes, hollowed out from tree trunks, bobbed along the muddy riverbanks, their owners vying for passengers. Eliza, as Elias, pushed her way through the throng, clutching her valise tightly. The heat was oppressive, immediately soaking her clothes. She felt a prickle of unease. This was a far cry from the orderly streets of Philadelphia. Here, the law of the jungle seemed to prevail. Her immediate task was to secure passage up the Chagres River to Gorgona or Cruces, the two main jumping-off points for the overland trek. The prices for canoe passage were extortionate, driven up by the sheer demand. She watched as desperate men haggled, often resorting to threats or bribes. She noticed Patrick O'Malley and Mr. Davies from the ship already engaged in a heated negotiation with a canoe owner. Thomas, the nervous young man, hovered nearby, looking utterly lost. Eliza hesitated, then decided to approach them. There was safety in numbers, and these were faces she recognized. "Looking for a ride, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice a little rougher than usual, trying to project a semblance of confidence. Patrick beamed. "Elias, good to see ye, lad. This thievin' rascal wants an arm and a leg for a trip up river." Mr. Davies, always composed, gave a curt nod. "The prices are indeed extortionate. We were attempting to pool our resources." Eliza quickly joined the discussion. She listened intently, then offered a suggestion, drawing on her father's business acumen. "Perhaps if we guarantee a return fare for their canoe, they'd be more willing to lower the initial price. They could pick up more passengers on the way back downriver." The canoe owner, a wizened man with shrewd eyes, grunted, considering her proposal. After some more spirited negotiation, they finally agreed on a price that, while still high, was more manageable when split 4 ways. Their canoe, a long, narrow vessel, was soon loaded with their meager belongings. The 4 men squeezed in, Eliza carefully positioning herself between Patrick and Mr. Davies, hoping to further minimize scrutiny. 2 native paddlers, their muscles rippling under their dark skin, expertly guided the canoe upstream. The journey up the Chagres River was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the droning of insects, the chirping of unseen birds, and the occasional roar of a howler monkey. The jungle pressed in on both sides, a vibrant, impenetrable wall of green. Exotic flowers bloomed in riotous colors, and strange, unfamiliar creatures darted through the undergrowth. But the beauty of the jungle was overshadowed by its dangers. The heat was relentless, a suffocating blanket that left them constantly drenched in sweat. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly, leaving itchy welts. And the water itself was a source of constant concern. Stories of alligators, venomous snakes, and deadly fevers were whispered among the passengers. Eliza tried to keep her spirits up, but the constant physical discomfort was draining. Her binding chafed, and the heavy, humid air made breathing difficult. She drank copious amounts of water, but felt perpetually thirsty. She forced herself to engage in light conversation with her companions, careful to keep her answers vague and her accent neutral. Patrick, ever the storyteller, regaled them with tales of his youth in Ireland, his voice echoing over the river. Mr. Davies, more reserved, offered insightful observations about the local flora and fauna, demonstrating a surprising depth of knowledge.
Thomas, still nervous, occasionally offered a hesitant comment, but mostly remained quiet. One afternoon, as they navigated a particularly narrow stretch of the river, a sudden, piercing scream echoed from the dense jungle. All eyes darted to the riverbank. A flash of movement, a blur of dark figures, and then the chilling glint of steel. Bandits. Panic erupted in the canoe. The paddlers, seasoned to such dangers, immediately accelerated, digging their paddles deep into the water. Patrick, quick as a flash, pulled out a small pistol from his belt. Mr. Davies, surprisingly, produced a sturdy walking stick, holding it like a club. Thomas cowered, his face pale with terror. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. This was not a test of her disguise, but a test of her courage. She instinctively reached for the small, blunt knife she had hidden in her boot, a meager defense, but better than nothing. The bandits, 3 grim-faced men, emerged from the trees, brandishing machetes and rusty firearms. They shouted demands in Spanish, their voices menacing. "Hold on tight, lads!" Patrick roared, aiming his pistol. He fired a shot into the air, the loud crack echoing through the jungle. The bandits hesitated, surprised by the resistance. The paddlers, taking advantage of the momentary lull, propelled the canoe forward with desperate strength. The river curved sharply, and within moments they were out of sight, leaving the angry shouts of the bandits to fade behind them. Once they were safely around the bend, the tension in the canoe slowly dissipated. Patrick, his face flushed with adrenaline, holstered his pistol. Mr. Davies straightened his spectacles, his hand still gripping his walking stick. Thomas was visibly trembling. Eliza, her own heart still racing, felt a surge of exhilaration mixed with profound relief. She had faced true danger, and she hadn't faltered. In that moment, the lines between Eliza and Elias blurred even further. She was simply a survivor. They reached Gorgona just as dusk settled, the sky ablaze with the vibrant colors of a tropical sunset. The village was a collection of ramshackle huts and makeshift tents, teeming with a mix of weary travelers and opportunistic locals. Their next challenge was the overland trek to Panama City, a journey of roughly 20 miles through dense jungle and over muddy, rocky trails. Mules were the primary mode of transport for supplies and those who could afford them. Most, however, walked. As they disembarked, exhausted and covered in mosquito bites, Eliza felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had survived the river. The jungle awaited, and with it, the next stage of her incredible deception.
Gorgona was a temporary haven, a bustling, chaotic stopover on the arduous route across the isthmus. The air buzzed with nervous energy, the chatter of excited prospectors mingling with the cries of vendors and the braying of mules. Makeshift taverns, little more than shacks with barrels of rum and rough tables, spilled out onto the muddy pathways. Eliza, Patrick, Mr. Davies, and Thomas found a relatively quiet corner to assess their next move. Their supplies were limited, mostly consisting of dried meat, hardtack, and a few personal items. Water was abundant, but often needed to be boiled or filtered to avoid sickness. "Right then, Lance," Patrick declared, wiping sweat from his brow. "Panama City next. Anyone fancy a stroll through the jungle?" He winked, but his eyes held a serious glint. Mr. Davies, consulting a small leather-bound map, chimed in. "Betrayal to Cruces is reportedly less treacherous but longer. The direct route to Panama City from Gorgona is shorter, but notoriously difficult, particularly after rains." Eliza, her mind racing, considered their options. Her feet were already aching from the limited walking on the ship and in Chagres. She knew she needed to conserve her energy. "Do we pool our money for mules?" she asked, trying to sound practical. "Even one for our shared supplies would make a significant difference." Their combined funds were meager, but after some deliberation, they agreed it was a wise investment. They managed to haggle for a sturdy mule and a local guide who promised to lead them to Panama City. The guide, a small, wiry man with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the jungle, spoke broken English but clearly understood the trails. The next morning, under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, they set off. The trail was immediately unforgiving. It was not a clear path, but rather a series of muddy ruts, treacherous roots, and slippery rocks winding through a suffocating tangle of vines and dense foliage. Eliza found herself constantly battling the terrain. Her boots, sturdy as they were, struggled to find purchase in the slick mud. She slipped and stumbled countless times, her muscles aching and burning. The dense canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, creating an eerie, perpetually twilight world. The heat was relentless, even more so now that they were exerting themselves. Sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes. Insects swarmed, and the constant threat of snakes or other unseen creatures kept her on edge. She watched her male companions. Patrick, with his robust physique, seemed to handle the conditions with a gruff resilience, though even he grumbled occasionally. Mr. Davies, despite his scholarly appearance, moved with surprising agility, his focus unwavering. Thomas, however, struggled immensely. He lagged behind, his face pale, his breathing labored. Eliza felt a pang of sympathy for Thomas. He was clearly out of his element, and the mental and physical toll of the journey was evident. She tried to offer words of encouragement, a gentle push to keep him moving. Midway through the day, the sky opened up. The rain, when it came, was not a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour, instantly transforming the muddy trail into a slick, treacherous river. They pressed on, soaked to the bone, their visibility severely limited. During a brief break, huddled under the meager shelter of a massive tree, Patrick noticed Eliza shivering uncontrollably. "You all right there, Eliza?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "You're looking a bit green." Eliza forced a smile, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just the chill, Patrick, and a bit weary." "Aye, this jungle takes it out of you," he agreed, pulling a flask from his bag. "Here, a little something to warm the bones." He offered her a swig of rum. Eliza hesitated. Alcohol was not something she was accustomed to, and she feared it might impair her judgment or loosen her tongue. But to refuse might draw suspicion. She took a small, hesitant sip. The fiery liquid burned her throat, but a surprising warmth spread through her stomach. They continued their grueling trek. Hours blurred into an endless cycle of walking, slipping, and pushing through the dense undergrowth. Eliza focused on placing one foot in front of the other, her mind the blank slate except for the burning desire to reach their destination. As dusk approached, the guide signaled a halt. They had found a small, relatively dry clearing and decided to make camp for the night. Building a fire in the damp conditions was a challenge, but eventually a small flickering blaze offered some warmth and a psychological boost. They ate their meager rations in relative silence, too exhausted for much conversation. The jungle came alive at night, filled with unseen rustlings, strange calls, and the incessant hum of insects. Eliza, wrapped in a thin blanket, found it impossible to truly rest. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. She worried about her disguise. The constant strain, the physical demands, the lack of proper hygiene, all of it chipped away at her carefully constructed facade. What if her voice cracked at the wrong moment? What if her lack of facial hair became too obvious? What if someone, in the dim light of the campfire, saw something in her eyes that betrayed her secret? Her anxiety was further fueled by Thomas. He had become increasingly withdrawn, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He barely ate and spoke only in whispers. I suspected he was teetering on the edge of giving up, or worse, falling ill. The night was long and restless.
Eliza dozed fitfully, waking to the sounds of the jungle and the gnawing worry in her stomach. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the jungle dripping and steaming under the returning sun. The next day's march was equally brutal, but the promise of Panama City spurred them on. They encountered other groups of prospectors, some looking weary and defeated, others still brimming with misguided optimism. Eliza exchanged brief greetings, trying to mimic the casual camaraderie of the men around her. Finally, late in the afternoon, after what felt like an eternity, the jungle began to thin. Through a break in the trees, Eliza caught her first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean, a shimmering expanse of blue stretching to the horizon, and beyond it, in the distance, the faint outlines of buildings, Panama City. A wave of profound relief washed over her. She had made it. She had survived the isthmus, a journey that had tested her physical and mental limits. She looked at Patrick, Mr. Davies, and even the struggling Thomas. They had faced it together. As they entered the outskirts of Panama City, a new kind of chaos awaited them. This was a bustling colonial city, a stark contrast to the wild jungle. Elegant Spanish architecture mingled with crude shacks, and the streets teemed with people of every conceivable background. Native Panamanians, Spanish colonials, American prospectors, and merchants from around the world. Eliza knew her journey was far from over. Panama City was merely another waypoint. Her ultimate destination, California, lay across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But as she walked through the crowded streets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced down the jungle, and she was stronger for it. Elias was becoming more than just a disguise. He was becoming a part of her.
Panama City was a revelation after the oppressive jungle. The vibrant colors of the colonial architecture, the bustling plazas, and the cool breezes from the Pacific Ocean were a welcome change. But it was also a city choked with desperate men, all waiting for the same thing: passage to California. The demand for ships heading north was astronomical, and the supply was painfully slow. News traveled by word of mouth, often exaggerated or completely false, fueling both hope and despair. Ships were arriving, but nowhere near enough to carry the thousands of prospectors stranded on the isthmus. Prices for passage skyrocketed, often paid in gold dust or exorbitant cash. Eliza, Patrick, Mr. Davies, and Thomas quickly discovered that finding a ship would be their next great challenge. They rented a small, dilapidated room in a crowded boarding house, sharing the space and the meager cost. Their days became a monotonous routine of walking the docks, inquiring at shipping offices, and listening to the endless rumors. Eliza maintained her Elias persona meticulously. She dressed in her worn male clothes, kept her cap pulled low, and spoke sparingly in public. She found that her experiences in the jungle had subtly altered her. She moved with a greater sense of purpose, her gaze more direct, less prone to the hesitant shyness of her former self. She observed the men around her. Many were growing increasingly restless, their initial optimism giving way to frustration and even anger. Arguments broke out frequently over perceived injustices, dwindling funds, and the suffocating weight. Disease was also a constant threat, and the makeshift hospitals were overflowing with feverish patients. One afternoon, while waiting at a shipping office, Eliza overheard two men discussing a desperate plan to buy a small, barely seaworthy schooner and sail it themselves. The idea was reckless, dangerous, but a testament to the desperation gripping the city. Eliza felt a chill. She knew the Pacific was not to be trifled with. Patrick, ever the optimist, tried to keep their spirits up with jokes and stories, but even his enthusiasm began to wane. Mr. Davies, always composed, spent his time reading or meticulously cleaning his spectacles, a silent indicator of his growing impatience. But Thomas was clearly struggling. He had fallen ill shortly after arriving in Panama City, a mild fever that left him weak and disoriented.
Eliza, drawing on fragmented memories of her mother's home remedies, tried to care for him as best she could, brewing herbal teas and fetching cool water. She worried constantly that his weakened state might lead him to inadvertently reveal her secret, or that she would have to tend to him in a way that would be too feminine. During his feverish ramblings, Thomas spoke of his family back home, of a young wife and a child he longed to return to. Eliza listened, her heart heavy. His desperation mirrored her own, though their motivations were very different. As the weeks dragged on, their funds dwindled to almost nothing. The shared mule had been sold for a fraction of what they paid, just to buy food. They considered taking odd jobs on the docks, but the competition was fierce. Eliza, desperate, found herself walking through the bustling market, eyeing the goods with a growing sense of despair. Her disguise felt like a heavy burden now, trapping her in a world where she had no legitimate means of income. As Eliza Shirley, she could have found work as a governess or a seamstress, but as Elias, her options were limited and often dangerous. One evening, as they sat in their cramped room contemplating their next meal, Patrick spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically somber. "Lads, I'm afraid my luck's run out. I've barely enough coin left for a few more days. I might have to try my hand at one of those smaller vessels. Risks be damned." Mr. Davies sighed, closing his book. "My own funds are similarly depleted. I fear the lure of gold may have blinded me to the practicalities of this endeavor." Eliza's heart sank. If they split up, her situation would become even more precarious. She needed their companionship, their collective presence to maintain her facade. I can count. I know a bit of numbers. I could help a merchant keep his ledgers or tally cargo. It's not much, but it might earn us enough for a few more days." She was treading on dangerous ground, revealing a skill that might be deemed too refined for a young man like Elias. Patrick looked at her surprised. "Well, I've seen worse ideas, lad. You're a clever one, Elias, always have been." The next day, Eliza, emboldened by their desperation, approached a grizzled merchant who was loudly complaining about his disorganized paperwork. She offered her services, presenting herself as a diligent, if inexperienced clerk. The merchant, overwhelmed and understaffed, grunted and gave her a trial. Eliza excelled. Her years of watching her father manage his business had given her an intuitive grasp of accounts. She quickly organized the merchant's chaotic ledgers, catching several errors and demonstrating an efficiency that surprised him. She worked diligently for 2 days, earning enough to buy a few more days of food for herself and her companions. The brief reprieve was a lifeline, but it was not a solution. The days continued to pass, and the crush of waiting prospectors only grew. The air was thick with the scent of stale rum, desperation, and the ever-present threat of disease. One morning, a collective cheer erupted from the docks. A large, majestic clipper ship, the Star of the West, was sailing into the harbor. It was bound for San Francisco, and it had space, albeit at a premium. A frantic rush ensued. Hundreds of men surged towards the docks, shouting, pushing, and waving their remaining money. Eliza, Patrick, Mr. Davies, and a surprisingly energized Thomas joined the fray. The scene was chaotic, almost violent, as men vied for the precious few tickets. Eliza, despite her small stature, found a surge of strength that she hadn't known she possessed. She pushed and shoved, determined not to be left behind. She saw men weeping, men fighting, men collapsing from exhaustion or despair. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to secure 4 tickets. They were for steerage, the cheapest and crampedest section of the ship, but it was passage. They were going to California. As they boarded the Star of the West, Eliza looked back at Panama City, a place that had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. She had faced danger, disease, and the gnawing uncertainty of waiting. She had maintained her disguise, forged unexpected friendships, and proven her resilience. The next leg of her journey would be across the vast Pacific, an even longer voyage than the first. The confined spaces of the ship would be another challenge to her secret, but as the clipper's sails unfurled and the ship began to glide through the shimmering waters of the Pacific, Eliza felt a renewed sense of purpose. California awaited, and with it, the promise of true freedom.
The Star of the West was a magnificent clipper, its towering masts and broad sails cutting a majestic figure against the endless blue of the Pacific. But below deck, in steerage, conditions were anything but grand. The space was cramped, dimly lit, and filled with the stale air of hundreds of unwashed bodies. Hammocks were slung in tight rows, barely leaving room to walk. The constant creaking of the ship's timbers, the smell of brine and unwashed humanity, and the relentless roll of the ocean quickly became the defining features of Eliza's new reality. Eliza, Patrick, Mr. Davies, and Thomas managed to secure hammocks near each other, a small comfort in the oppressive environment. The journey to San Francisco was estimated to take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the winds. It would be the longest stretch of time Eliza had to maintain her disguise in such close quarters. She quickly established a routine. She woke early when the light was still dim and tried to perform what meager hygiene she could, splashing water on her face and attempting to brush her teeth with a rough cloth. She kept her hair short and tucked under her cap and continued to bind her chest tightly. The discomfort was a constant companion, but it was a small price for her freedom. Food was monotonous and often unappetizing: salted beef, hard tack, and weak coffee. Fresh water was rationed. Sickness, a perpetual fear on such voyages, was rampant. Seasickness claimed many, but others suffered from dysentery and fevers. Eliza, miraculously, remained healthy, a testament to her inherent resilience or perhaps sheer luck. She spent her days observing her fellow passengers. They were a diverse lot: farmers, laborers, tradesmen, and even a few disgraced gentlemen, all united by the golden dream. They gambled, told stories, argued politics, and dreamed of the fortunes that awaited them. Eliza joined in the conversations cautiously, offering brief comments, always careful to keep her voice low and her opinions non-committal. She learned to chew tobacco, a common habit among men, though she discreetly spat it over the side of the ship when no one was looking. She mimicked their posture, their way of leaning against a railing, their casual swearing. Each small detail was a reinforcement of her male personage. Patrick, ever gregarious, found himself at the center of many conversations, his booming laughter echoing through steerage. Mr. Davies, true to form, often retreated to a quiet corner with a book, though he occasionally engaged in spirited debates with other passengers about the state of the world or the future of California. Thomas, having recovered from his fever, was still quiet but seemed to gain a new resolve, his eyes fixed on the horizon. One particular challenge was the lack of privacy. Changing clothes, even for basic hygiene, was a logistical nightmare. Eliza learned to be quick, discreet, and always have her back to any potential onlookers. She never allowed herself to be completely naked, always keeping a shirt or trousers on, even if it meant a quick, awkward wash underneath. A few times, the sheer monotony and claustrophobia of the journey threatened to break her. She would sneak up to the deck late at night when most passengers were asleep and gaze at the vast star-strewn ocean. In those moments of solitude, she allowed herself to be Eliza again, to feel the ache of loneliness, the weight of her deception, and the terrifying uncertainty of her future. She would whisper to the stars a silent prayer for strength and perseverance. One blustery afternoon, a young man named Jake, a boisterous and somewhat crude prospector, attempted to strike up a more personal conversation with Eliza. "So, Elias, where's your woman waiting for you back home? Or are you looking for a golden bride in California?" Eliza's heart pounded. This was precisely the kind of direct question she feared. She forced a laugh, trying to sound dismissive. "No woman waiting, Jake. And as for a bride, I'm after gold, not a wife." She quickly changed the subject, asking him about his prospecting plans, redirecting his attention. He, thankfully, took the bait, launched into a rambling description of his imagined gold claim. Her quick thinking saved her, but it highlighted the constant vigilance required. Every interaction, every word, was a potential pitfall. As the weeks wore on, the passengers grew increasingly weary.
The initial excitement had long since faded, replaced by a grim determination. Arguments became more frequent, and the close quarters frayed nerves. Eliza witnessed several fistfights and narrowly avoided being drawn into one herself. Then, one glorious morning, a shout echoed across the ship. "Land ho!" A collective surge of energy galvanized the ship. Passengers scrambled onto the deck, their eyes scanning the horizon. And there it was, faint at first, then growing clearer, the rugged coastline of California. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost buckled Eliza's knees, washed over her. Relief, exhaustion, triumph, and a profound sense of awe. She had done it. She had crossed the oceans, survived the perils of the isthmus, and maintained her